It's always good to have you with us, Dr. Navon. What are the main issues for Israel in particular going into today's meeting?
So the two main issues are, as always, first of all, Syria, the situation in Syria, making sure that Israel and Russia continue to coordinate their respective moves in the skies of Syria. And the second issue is, of course, Iran. The Iranian nuclear program, as we've heard recently, the U.S. administration itself is at this point having very low expectations on the possibility of reaching a nuclear agreement with Iran, and Israel is checking out what the Russians are up to. Are they helping, or are they trying to hurt the chances of an agreement being reached between the U.S. and Iran? And I think it's important for Israel to find out exactly what the Russians are up to when it comes to those negotiations that seem to be failing regarding the nuclear deal with Iran.
Well, certainly a lot more to get into on all of those topics here, but along the same lines and starting with the basics here, what are the main issues for Russia when Israel comes to Moscow to visit? In other words, what's Israel have to offer? It was long speculated all the years under the Netanyahu governments that just what deals or how Netanyahu was able to leverage Russia to cooperate.
Well, Russia is aware of the fact that Israel is the greatest power of the Middle East, the greatest military power, but also the strongest economy in the region. It is also the region's country with the strongest ties with the United States. And therefore, Russia, being a large power that wants to influence the Middle East, cannot ignore Israel and needs to coordinate with Israel. So what Israel has to offer is not only its military power, its economic power as well, but its special relationship with the United States, and the fact that, as I said, Israel is the greatest power of the Middle East and has to be dealt with on any move by the Russians.
Now, the rapport between Israel's new government and Russia seemingly being established as we are speaking here, but there's also a summit between Prime Minister Bennett and Vladimir Putin coming up in October, I understand. But is today part of a critical moment where ties are either made or broken between the new government in Israel and the Russian regime?
Well, definitely interpersonal relations are important. But at the end of the day, besides those personal relations, there are interests. And in the case of Israel and Russia, there are indeed many conflicting interests in the Middle East. It seems to be that there was a relation of mutual respect between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. It will be up for the new Prime Minister, for Naftali Bennett, to build a working relationship with the Russian president. And definitely there are many challenges for Israel because it is a delicate relationship for Israel to handle, precisely because of the global conflict between Russia and the United States, whether it's over the Ukraine or the Caucasus or the Middle East. And therefore, on the one hand, Israel has to make sure that it can continue to coordinate its moves with the Russian government regarding Syria. But on the other hand, at the end of the day, Israel cannot go too far in upgrading its relation with Moscow, because that would imply a clash with the United States.
I want to bring us back in one of the arenas we mentioned here, Syria, here recently, and by recently, the last few months, we've seen significantly ramped up Russian pushback against the alleged ongoing Israeli strikes in Syria. Why is that? With them releasing data on how many planes were flying, how many missiles were shot, things we'd never seen the Russians do before. Why is that apparent shift taking place?
Well, because the Russians are testing Israel's relation with the United States precisely as the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, as the U.S. is trying and apparently failing to reach a new agreement with Iran. So that's when Putin is trying to flex his muscles and show to everyone who is the boss in the Middle East. But at the end of the day, let us not forget that, yes, Russia has a powerful army, but it has a very weak and small economy, and it is not a great power. It is no longer a great power. It still has some attributes of a great power, but at the end of the day, it has a very weak economy, and it was not able to rebuild Syria or to impose a political order or arrangement in Syria. So basically, Putin is trying to flex his muscles and try to show that America is retreating, but he does not have the means of his policy.
Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you so far. As this bit of a preview here as we are waiting the press conference for Foreign Minister Lapid and Foreign Minister Lavrov. Stay with us. But we do move on to